things on a face, you actually can conjure up that feeling in your mind. Anger has pursed lips or open mouth, that can go either way. Lowered and wrinkled brow with staring eyes. Happiness is smiling, of course, raised cheeks, mouth open or closed. And sadness is trembling lip, lips turned downward, and corners of the upper eyelid may be raised. So that's just kind of in words the way that we would describe those 6 feelings. But let me show you some examples. Okay. Here are these 6 emotions. And clearly you can tell from the faces that these pictures were taken quite a while ago, but this was actually done in a study trying to determine the universality of feelings and the universality of facial expressions. And so those 6 feelings, happy, sad, scared, angry, disgusted, and whatever the other one was, surprised, you can see those portrayed with these people. And so these were, at least at the time, kind of the very quintessential, this is what that feeling looks like when it's expressed on a face. And the researchers have taken this and modified this study over and over and over again, replicated it in many different scenarios, and they consistently find the same results. So it's kind of interesting to look at the descriptions that we just used, which, let me pull those back up. The descriptions that we just used in, contrast to when you actually see them on the face. It's kind of interesting. So surprise, fear, disgust, anger, happiness, sadness, you can see them all right there. Okay, so let me pull up another one for you. This is the same girl, which I liked that this one actually shows, because when there's different people communicating the feeling, you wonder how much of it is just that person. So I liked that this was actually the same person used for the 3. Fear is actually, I'm sorry, I can make this bigger. Fear, upper eyelids are raised. Disgust, the nose is wrinkled. And anger, the jaws thrust forward. And so you can clearly see, even if you look at them one at a time, you can clearly see the feeling being communicated without even reading the words underneath it. Okay, and this one is such an interesting research study. Just to give you a very brief background, this is one of the most famous facial expression and emotion studies ever conducted. It was actually done with an indigenous people group, and I want to say it was in, at this point I'm not going to remember where it was, but these individuals had never interacted with Westerners. They had never seen a white person. They had no electricity. They had never listened to a radio. They had never watched TV. Literally, they were one of the most remote people groups on the face of the earth. And the researchers went in and tried to determine, with no outside influence, were there universality and were there facial expressions that could be, across cultures, across the world, the same. And they found that yes, there are those 6 that we mentioned. And I know it's very hard to read, so I will read it to you. The picture on the left says, with a translator, he said, now let me back up. Because there was no Western influence, no Western reference, they had to be very sensitive to their culture. And so it wasn't, show me what you look like if you were happy. They wanted to make sure that they gave them contexts in which they would be able to see about the true emotion. And so the left picture says, show me what your face would look like if you were about to fight. And so very clearly, anger, you can see it. The center picture, show me what your face would look like if you learned your child had died. As you can see, very sad. And show me what your face would look like if you met friends. And on the right, there's the happiness. So interesting to look at how across the world, in a culture that had no similarity to our own, that you can find universality of feelings and facial expressions. Okay, and one final thing I wanted to show you, and this only somewhat relates, but I just love the visual of this. And so when we're talking about nonverbals and emotions, I wanted you to have this concept because it's just so fascinating. So okay, at the top you can see the actual 3D view of the cone, if you will. Okay, and then from the top, it's as if all of those individual strips were unfolded so that you can see them all at one time. So that's what you're looking at, okay? And the really interesting thing about these emotions is how they all relate to each other. And so if you look at the center of the cone, they are the most significant, deep emotions. So you have terror, amazement, grief, loathing, rage, vigilance, ecstasy, admiration. Notice those are the darkest colors, which means it's the most saturated feelings. As you go down the petals, the colors get lighter and the feelings get lessened. So you go from terror to fear, then to apprehension. You go from rage to anger to annoyance. And so, as you can see, it's graduated. So you have your most intense feelings at the center. It trickles down to less intense. Now, another interesting thing, you can look at these in terms of dyads and triads. So rage and loathing will often go together. Loathing and grief will often go together. Ecstasy and admiration will often go together. And that's even true when you go down the petals. So you have anticipation and joy that would go together. So those are the dyads of emotions. Then you have triads, where you can look at groups of threes. So you would have joy, trust, and fear. And it seems like fear and trust may not go together, but you have to get past your fear in order to trust. And you can't really have joy unless you have trust. So you can see how they all play together. Now, another interesting thing is you also have opposites. So if you go directly across, you have loathing versus admiration. You have grief versus ecstasy. So there's even opposites in your emotions. And then just one last point, as you can see, if you separate the petals, you have an emotion that is often in between the two of those. So the combination of two creates a new feeling. So if you have serenity and acceptance, that creates love. If you have pensiveness and distraction, that creates disapproval. So really, really a neat concept. I love the visual because I think it really helps us see how emotions are so complex. And so if we're thinking about how are we expressing emotions most readily, it's facial expressions, it's nonverbal. So we have to be well versed and we have to be practiced in interpreting nonverbals and even in expressing nonverbals, because we want to make sure that we're expressing our emotions effectively. So that's just kind of something that I really think is helpful, and I'm a visual person, so I think that really kind of gives me a good perspective on that. Okay, so let's get back to the presentation now. Alrighty. So remember, we've been going through specifically in detail what those categories of nonverbals are. So we're into vocal cues now. Joy and anger are easy to identify. If you think about what does someone sound like when they're experiencing joy, what does someone sound like when they're experiencing anger, you can easily identify what those vocal cues would sound like. Shame and love are more difficult. Vocal cues can be confusing. You can confuse love with sadness. If you think about the person that's really like syrupy with how much they just love someone, and their voice gets that that's very similar to the sadness sound. So there's that confusion potentially. Pride with satisfaction can be confusing. Fear with nervousness can be confusing. So as you can see, sometimes the vocal cues are not necessarily specific, and so that can be a little bit challenging. Cues show self-confidence and knowledge. So the way that we speak and the tone of our voice can convey certain things, especially those specific things, self-confidence and knowledge. Back channel cues are regulatory. In other words, they signal when we want to talk or not. And so when we talk about back channel cues, those are things that we use vocally, but they're not words. And that's why they're called back channel, because it's almost like you're trying to circumvent using the words. So you might clear your throat, or you might go, oh, and you communicate through those cues that you are ready to say something, even if you're not necessarily asking for permission to say something. Speech rate affects how you are viewed, interestingly. So how quickly you speak, not good or bad, just the level of, the level that you speak as far as how quickly you communicate with words, that affects how people interpret what you're saying. Silence speaks volumes. So silence can be used very effectively. It can be used very awkwardly as well. And so I'm kind of curious, how would you use silence? And are you comfortable with silence? I will tell you, as a therapist, silence is extremely effective. It's extremely helpful, but it is one of the hardest things to get used to, and it's one of the hardest things to practice. And it takes a lot of diligence to get to a point where you can sit and just be with someone and not have to say anything. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that. How do you use silence, and are you comfortable with it? Okay, I know that has been a lot. So if you need a break, feel free. And I know you've been interpreting my nonverbal cues, especially my yawns. I admit I'm tired. So if you want to take a rest and go grab something to eat or drink or use the restroom or whatever, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll keep going. Okay, just a little humor for you to break up the monotony of this. Here's your little Peanuts cartoon, and they're sitting on top of the doghouse, and as you can see, there's nonverbal communication going on because they don't speak the same language, and all of a sudden the response is, okay, I'll move. And then kind of warily he's looking back, and he says I was violating his body space. So that brings us to personal space. When we talk about nonverbals, personal space is very important. So let's kind of talk about a few of the specifics. Proxemics is one of those things. That is the study of how close or how far away from people we arrange ourselves. So if you think about, that's probably not a word you've heard, but you've probably heard of proximity. So if you think about if something is in your proximity, it's somewhat close to you. So proxemics is the study of how close or how far away from people we arrange ourselves. So it's basically, our personal space, if you will. And I always think about Dirty Dancing, which, by the way, for those of you Dirty Dancing fans, and I know that's an old movie and maybe that's showing my age, I'm not sure. Oh my gosh, great movie though. They are actually redoing Dirty Dancing. The producer of that movie from 25 years ago, just on So You Think You Can Dance this season, said he's going to redo that movie. So now with Patrick Swayze dead and Jennifer Grey, who has had plastic surgery and looks nothing like what she used to, we are now going to have new and improved Dirty Dancing for this generation. So I'm so excited. Anyway, if you've seen that movie, I am getting to a point. If you've seen that movie, when she's learning to dance with him, she's like all confused and crazy, and he says, this is my space, this is your space. I don't go into yours, you don't go into mine. And I always think about that, because how we arrange ourselves and how close we are to someone, that's our level of comfort with our personal space. And so if you want to be very specific with intimate or with space, intimate space is the smallest. It's 0 feet, which means you're, very intertwined, or 1.5 feet. So between 0 and 1.5 feet, obviously this would only be with people that you're well acquainted, unless you're in a crowded place. So if you're in a packed elevator,